Oh, hi there. I was just catching up on the latest issue of Amazing Stories. Lo and behold, the illustration on the cover of the bathing suit clad lady peering at a devilish hairy monster. Isn't that of an interesting story? But I skipped ahead. There's another story in here. Funny enough. And it was about time travel. I say we read that one instead. This isn't going to be that interesting visually. So I've included an MP3 download link where you can copy the URL of this video and play it in your car. Or horse and buggy if you're an Amish. Because it will be interesting audibly. Let's begin. The Vault of the Ages by Robert Silverberg. They are sending you into the future to look around. Everything is fine until you come to the times when humanity is going the way of the buffalo and the dodo. Does this worry you? Don't let it. Just write your report and come back, or you'll find yourself playing nursemaid and babysitter to the last man on Earth. When I agreed to pilot the first time machine to the future, I expected it to be a quick trip. My instructions were simply to look around, see what the world of 10 million AD was like, and return. Return. What a sweet word. I often dream of returning to the bustling, crowded world of 2075 I left behind. But here is where I belong, and here is where I must stay. The time machine, the first of its kind, seemed to work pretty well after some tests with rabbits and such. And so it was decided to hire a test pilot, me, and see what would happen. I remember the ring of taut, anxious faces that surrounded me in the lab that day as I climbed up the pedestal and threw open the heavy copper door and got in. They were all excited. You would have thought they were the ones risking their necks, not me. But that's the way it always is. They were worried about the success or failure of their time machine project. I had nothing to lose but my neck. So after the proper speeches and impressive sounding explanations to the press, I was told I could leave. The big moment had come. I clanged shut the door, flipped the switch as instructed, and let the cybernetic governors take over control of the time vessel. I only half believed the thing would work, and I didn't much care. My pay was the same either way. There was a low singing hum, and I saw the bearded face of Professor von Brod, who was watching me through the port, melt and swirl as the time vessel picked up momentum, and then I peered through the port and saw that not only the professor, but also everyone else and the whole laboratory had vanished. I was alone in the grey nothingness of the space-time continuum. I looked at my watch, 10 after 2. I was scheduled to spend a few hours in the future and then return to 2075 at precisely 2:15 the same day. To the onlookers, only 5 minutes would have passed, no matter how much time I spent in the future. I sat back comfortably and waited. After a while, I got bored watching the grey blackness go whizzing by. The big dial in the front told me that only about 3 million years had elapsed, and thus I hadn't even reached the halfway point in my journey. I began to wander around the ship. It was fairly spacious and well furnished. There was a good library of sensotapes and a projector, also a healthy stock of synthetic food concentrates, and a drug closet that included a considerable supply of Rejuvenal, the new miracle rejuvenating drug. Puzzled, I surveyed the treasure trove for several minutes, wondering why in blazes a ship expected to be gone for part of a day at most would be stocked with all this stuff. Then the answer occurred to me, and it didn't make me very happy when I figured it out. They were making sure that I'd be well provided for, in case the ship got stuck somewhere. This was a trial run. They weren't at all sure the time vessel was going to function as they expected, and they intended to make things as cozy as possible for their poor test pilot in case he met with some unforeseen fate in the far future, such as discovering that the time machine went only in one direction, forward. Professor Van Brod had assured me that the journey in both directions would be as safe as a subway ride, but obviously some of the others in the project had their doubts about it, in view of the things that had been packed on board for my benefit. I stared angrily out of the greyness for a few minutes, annoyed at myself for letting them mislead me, before it occurred to me that I was being foolish. As a professional test pilot, I'd faced worse dangers than this before, and had somehow always come out, mostly in one piece. It was my job. I had no right to kick about possible danger. I must have dozed off for a while, because the next thing I knew, there was a fairly solid bump as the ship settled to the ground. A gong went off, and when I looked up, I saw the dial registering 10 million. End of journey. I dashed to the porthole and looked out. Well, the ship hadn't been a failure, at least. There was no way of telling where, when I actually was, but it was definite that the ship had gone somewhere. I wasn't in the laboratory anymore, for sure. Outside, everything was perfectly flat and bleak. I saw long vistas of brown, grassless plains, with no trace of mountains. Evidently, the ceaseless work of the wind had worn away the hills. Up above was the sun, looking pretty much like the sun I remembered. It seemed a little dimmer and a little redder, but not very much so. I flattened my nose against the pane, trying to see around the corner of the ship. But as far as I could see, there was just this emptiness. I checked my guns to see if they were loaded. They were, and thus armed against any terror the future might hold, I started to heave open the outside door. A minute later, I emerged and dropped lightly to the ground, 10 million years ahead. The air was clean and sweet, with a pleasant cold tang in it. I didn't know what month I'd landed in, of course, but it seemed like late autumn weather, when the air has that sharp, fresh quality of oncoming winter. I started to walk. Empty everywhere. Just the endless, unvegetated plain. It was a worn-out planet, or else a very young one. The wild thought struck me that perhaps I'd gone backwards, not forwards in time. Perhaps I'd thought I had plunged into the misty past, back before the beginning of life. Then I walked around the ship, and what I saw convinced me that I'd gone in the right direction. It was a giant building, leaping up from the bare plain like a great gleaming tooth clawing at the sky. All around it was the desolate wasteland, and the lone skyscraper seemed incredibly incongruous in the vast prairie. Hesitantly, I moved towards it. It was streamlined and glowing with a radiant warmth that had no particular visible source. And it was windowless. I crossed the half-mile that separated it from my time vessel quickly, listening to the thud-thud of my footsteps as they broke the eternal silence of this distant era. When I approached, I saw, carved over the door in letters 10 feet high, the inscription, "The Vault of the Ages." I drew forth my camera and photographed it for use as evidence when I returned. Then I headed for the doors, and they swung open as I came close to them. I stepped in, and the sound of my foot crossing the threshold was doubled and redoubled fantastically by the echoes, which went running wildly up to the far-off end of the corridor. I was in a museum, the final museum of mankind. I wandered through the brightly lit, dustless, silent hallways for hours, forgetting how the time was passing. It made no difference anyway. The time machine was set to return me to the point in time exactly 5 minutes after my departure, no matter how much time elapsed for me in the future. And what I saw in the Vault of the Ages was too exciting to come away from voluntarily. It was nothing less than a record of man's accomplishments from the very beginnings. Near the front entrance I saw incredibly ancient-looking clay tablets, saw time-yellowed bone knives and chopping tools from the unimaginably distant past. As I moved on, the exhibits kept pace. There was a colourful reproduction, or was it the original, of the cave drawings from Altamira and other relics of primitive man. Then I saw the implements of civilization, books, money, tools. There was an automobile there, an amazingly well-preserved Model T, an airplane, a V2 rocket, every example of man's ingenuity. But the whole of our paltry 2,000-odd years took up just a tiny part of the museum, for there were 10 million years to come. I saw an entire spaceship on the 3rd floor. I saw a model of my time machine. I saw things I did not understand, and other things I don't want to talk about. I wandered on through the endless halls for hours on end, just barely scratching the surface of what was to be seen. The museum was a repository for every accomplishment of mankind throughout all his long history. And then, just as I was starting to feel hunger pangs and was on the point of deciding to turn back and return later, I came to a bend in the corridor. I rounded it, and my eyes were struck with a glowing, luminescent radiance emanating from a large metal door. I moved closer and read the inscription on it: Man's Finest Achievement. And as I took another hesitant step closer, I broke the photoelectronic beam, and the mighty door swung open. "Welcome, man of the past," a thin, dry voice said. I stared ahead into the inky blackness that enfolded me, struggling to regain the use of my eyes. Finally, I became used to the dark, and I looked around to see who had spoken. And I saw them. There were a dozen of them, tiny, wrinkled, hideously ancient gnomes, sitting in immense chairs. Their chests were rising and falling, slowly, methodically, but that was the only sign of life. Who are you?" I stammered. "We are all that is left," said the same voice, and now I realized that no voice had spoken, except in my mind. These ancients were communicating telepathically. "All?" I asked. "There are 12 of us," the voice said. 6 men, 6 women. We have been here 1,000 years. And we will remain 1,000 years more. Someday, perhaps, we will die." There was a note of longing in that last sentence, of great age yearning for the long-delayed end. I looked at them, the last 12 men and women of Earth, sitting there like so many dried-up prunes, waiting for death. The race that had done so much, that had left the proud memorial that stood alone on the deserted planet, had come to this. 12 old fossils waiting to die. There were 20 when we came here, another telepathic voice said, taking up the story. 8 of us have been fortunate. Someday, death will come to the rest of us, and we will have ended our long wait. I stood in the middle of the darkened room, feeling their presences around me. Why has this happened? Why are you here, just waiting to die? What else is there to do? One of them asked sadly. We have grown old, said another. We can have no children. We feel it is time that mankind's strivings reach their end, and the end is long in coming. Some of us have waited 10,000 years. 10,000 years? No wonder they were tired of life. It was incredible. The last people on earth, all long past the age of childbirth, sitting in the vast museum in the darkness at the end of time, their own prime exhibits, and nothing could be done. Nothing? Yes, something. The thought struck me at once. I looked around at the 12 living corpses. Don't go away, I said. I'll be right back. The utter inanity of what I'd just said didn't strike me until I was outside the museum and dashing frantically over to the plane, back to my ship. I found what I wanted and hurried back. Rejuvenol, that was the answer, the miracle drug. Perhaps it might not be too late to reverse time for these last survivors of man's greatness, to turn the clock back and make them young again. My employers had thoughtfully included the Rejuvenol for my use, in case I was unable to return and wanted to prolong my life. The newly discovered drug, the wonder drug of the age, relieved the sufferings of old age, brought about rebirth of vitality and youthful vigor. But this was a use its manufacturers had never dreamed of. I was bringing new life to a dying planet. I followed the path through the winding building to the great shining door once again and burst in. What are you going to do? I'm going to bring you back to life, I said. This drug, maybe you don't know about it. It dates from the dawn of time, practically. 2075 AD, my era. What will it do to us? It'll make you young again, I said, as I started to prepare the injections. You can go out and re-people the earth and keep the flame of life going. Why? Why start all over? I ignored the mournful question. It seemed to me that there was nothing else I could do but bring these last men and women from their lethargy. Give them the restored vitality that would continue the race, as long as the power to do so was in my hands. I went up to the first of them, fumbled in its robes. These dried-up ancients were so withered I couldn't tell the men from the women, and found the biceps. I plunged the hypodermic in, then hastily sterilized the needle and ran on to the next. And by the time I had injected the 12th, I saw, gratifyingly, that the first one was already beginning to stir from its eon-old position of repose. He was becoming young again. Why did you do that to us? One of them asked. I only smiled and watched as color flooded back into the faded faces. There was no need to explain now. Later, when their minds were young again, they would understand what it was to live and explore and take chances, the sort of chances that I took myself when I signed on for the time machine job. I watched the change take place before my eyes as the years rapidly peeled away from them. Then, suddenly, a vivid, angry thought struck me. You fool, what kind of dose did you give us? The normal dose for an elderly adult, I said. 1 cubic centimeter. Idiot! Why, what's wrong? What's wrong, you ask? In 10 million years, the human race has evolved, the cold voice said, lecturing me painfully. Our organs are more efficient, our bloodstreams more direct. Had I miscalculated? They seem to be growing rapidly younger. Too rapidly. Don't you understand? The voice asked. The dose you gave us was calculated on the basis of the needs of your own clumsy, primitive bodies, not ours. You've given us a gigantic overdose. I was relieved at that. After all, so what if I'd overdosed them? Rejuvenol, up to now, had been used on people in their 70s and 80s, and it seemed only logical that men and women who dated their ages in thousands of years would need a stronger dose to achieve the same effect, so I wasn't worried. But the outbreak of violent cries of anger continued, coming in chorus from all 12, and I began to see that I'd done something terribly wrong. It became more apparent as the character of the cries changed from roars of anger to high-pitched, wordless whines. In a couple of hours, the transformation was complete, and I looked at the product of my handiwork. 12 naked, squealing babies. I was responsible for this, and it was my duty now to help them and care for them. That was 5 years ago, and they're growing up into nice little toddlers now. I didn't dare leave them to go back to 2075 for help, out of fear that they'd lock me up and put me away. I couldn't risk that, not with 12 helpless babies to take care of. So, I've stayed here, stranded 10 million years in the future, waiting for these kids to grow up. Luckily, the Vault of the Ages had some diapers and such things preserved in its awe-embracing collections. I figure another 5 years, and it will be safe to leave the kids to rebuild society on their own. And then I'll go back to 2075. And won't they be surprised when I come out of that machine 15 years older than when I went in. In the meantime, I'm stuck here, nursemaid and babysitter to the last men on Earth. The end. Well, wasn't that great? Great time travel / Halloween story for this month of October. Thanks for listening if you made it to this far. And if you haven't, you can't hear my voice.